Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
Creature in the Mountains by Anonymous. One summer, I was staying with an older cousin and his wife in 1983 or 84. I was either 13 or 14 at the time. They lived in the mountains somewhere out of Elmira. Not sure of the exact spelling, but it's close to Eugene. My cousin and his wife were new to Oregon, and they had recently moved there from Bakersfield, California. My cousin was wanting to do some scouting as deer season was soon coming up, so one morning we packed a lunch and headed out into the forest from his house. In this area, there was only one paved road, and in the direction we headed, there was only one dirt road that soon ended. There was a fairly good hiking trail that we traveled on for maybe an hour and a half, and then we came upon a smaller, less traveled path that we stayed on for a good 45 minutes, stopping now and again on the edge of small clearings. The forest became too thick to see very far at all, so we decided to try and make our way up onto the side of a mountain we had been traveling at the base of. After about 30 or 40 minutes of dead-end game trails, we had gotten high enough that the forest started to thin a bit. We came to a small clearing that gave us a slight view of the valley below, and we decided that we had gone far enough and decided to stop there and eat before turning back. It wasn't but just a moment after getting our food out and sitting back on an old log that we heard some rustling and snapping of twigs, what seemed just like out of our sight in the dense forest. By the sound of the twigs, we both knew that this couldn't be a rabbit or any small animal. My cousin instantly turned and whispered, "Bear!" We were still for about a minute. Then came identical noises from the opposite side of the clearing. This really confused me as the sounds were rather loud and I didn't see how it could have moved to the other side of the clearing without us hearing. My cousin then whispered, "Two bears." He then whispered, "They smell the food." Just then there was a loud snap in the area of the second noise, and another thing that was most frightening was the loudness of the cracking. I thought, this is one huge bear. Over the next 2 minutes, I was terrified as the snapping and breaking of what must have been large branches was changing position around the clearing. Never did the noise come simultaneously from the same spot. It wasn't until I heard the shot that I saw my cousin with a snub-nosed .38 pointed in the air. As soon as he fired, there came a loud, powerful roar that started low in pitch and ended very high, but not shrill. It was a warning, and I will never forget it. As soon as this powerful yell, scream, bellow ended, we were on our feet running in the direction we had come from. After about 50 yards, to our horror, there came another yell, and I was sure this thing was following us. We began running full speed, and I instantly started getting scratched and stuck by the thick forest. We were running downhill, and at about 150 to 200 yards later, it screamed again. It seemed so close, but we never saw anything. No movement, shadow, shape, nothing. We were now running as fast as we possibly could on the paths, and I can only describe it as reckless abandon. Several times I lost my feet and rolled and dove through ferns, trees, and thorny bushes. I became separated from my cousin, but never slowed up, as the scream would repeat approximately every 20 seconds. Once back on the trail, my cousin emerged about 50 feet from me, and we still ran for what must have been a mile before this thing let up and started giving us some distance. But every time we started to stop or even slow, it would yell out again as if to say, "Not yet, get going." It was the most tired I had ever been. My lungs and throat were way past hurting, and I was so tired I was dizzy. I felt as if I would pass out at any moment. We made it back to the house where his wife was waiting at the door, having heard the shots and the screams. My skin was ripped to shreds from the forest. My cousin refused to believe it was something like Bigfoot, although he knew it was no bear. He thought maybe it was some pissed-off crazy mountain man, and I knew there was not a man alive that could have kept up with us, let alone make that noise. I only went outside 2 more times in the next week I was there, once to go to the library, and then to hit the train home. We went to the library to research what we could have experienced. My cousin believed it was a panther, but I don't think he actually believed that. What's weird is, he wouldn't let me talk about it to anyone other than him. Strange Encounter in Northern New Mexico by Expectant. So, a little backstory. My friends and I have been hiking and backpacking around the area many times, and at least once a year on a good long multi-day backpacking trip. A few times in this same location, and other than car problems and sometimes friends not bringing the right gear, we've never had any issues. This specific trip was a 6-mile in, 6-mile out, 6K total elevation shift, both ways trip to a lake. We went in October, so we were preparing for extreme cold, potentially below freezing at night. There were only 3 of us, and we were all geared up for this, and I was probably the least geared out of the trio, and I knew I'd be perfectly comfortable. So we began the trek in. It took us until the end of the day, and we got to the lake no problem, set up camp, and just enjoyed ourselves with the sounds of nature, some MREs, and a couple of pints of whiskey. At the end of the night, we all settled into our sleeping quarters, myself in a small tent, my friend in a hammock right next to me around the fire pit. Our other friend was some distance away from us in a tent. Now, it's important to note that my friend in the hammock was camped right next to me, maybe 10 feet away, while our other friend was probably 100 feet away or so. I had trouble sleeping. I was restless, and even though I was warm, I kept getting shivers frequently and tossing and turning in my sleeping bag. I just attributed that to the cold, and I didn't think anything of it at the time. And eventually, I began to drift asleep. The forest around us was quiet, with the occasional sounds of insects buzzing, or a bird taking flight from a tree. And that's when I was awoken by the sound of my friend's voice. Clear as day, I was groggy and a little confused as to why he was waking me up, but I could hear him say, "Expectant. Help me." I immediately froze as he sounded really desperate, and he said, "Expectant. Help me," again. Then, before I got the chance to speak, I heard the voice again. "Expectant. Help, I have to pee." And then he laughed in a way that sincerely only my friend does. It was a giggle that I'd known him to have since we had met many years ago. So I responded, "Haha, fuck off, I'm trying to sleep." And I thought that he was just trying to be funny. Thinking back on it, it would have been very out of character for him to wake me up to pull some stupid joke like that. But I was half asleep, and I wrote it off. Although I knew something didn't feel quite right about it, I decided to just ignore him and let him do his business. He persisted. "Help. I need you. Come out here." I just mumbled about going back to sleep and to just go if he needed to. My memory is a little foggy as to how long we conversed back and forth and what exactly was said. But afterwards, I had noticed that he hadn't made any noise to leave to go pee or get back in his hammock as I was trying to fall back asleep, which I found odd. But again, brushed it off as nothing. Once the voice had been gone for a while, and I assumed he had quietly gone on and gotten back to his hammock, I realized I had to pee badly, and I wasn't going to get any sleep until I did so. So I got out of my tent and immediately walked over to his hammock to pull the same stunt he had on me, calling his name in a joking manner and waking him up to let him know I was there. But when he woke up, he was immediately thrown off by this. And that's when I told him I was just going to go pee like you had told me you were a bit ago. Maybe 15 minutes had passed, and not enough time for someone to get back into their multi-layer cold weather hammock setup and fall deeply asleep again. Not to mention, he hadn't made a sound since our conversation stopped. He asked me what the hell I was talking about, and I asked him over and over if he was just outside my tent. He swore up and down he had been asleep since he had laid down that night and never once got out of his hammock. That's when I felt the real chills go down my spine. Whatever had been outside my tent asking help in this high-pitched mocking voice that my friend would sometimes joke with was not him. I told him, oh, okay, it was nothing, and then I proceeded to go pee, keeping my eyes on my surroundings the whole time. Eventually, I was able to get back in my tent, warm up, and get drowsy enough to sleep, even though the events that had just transpired terrified me to my core. I am well aware of the lore of the areas around northern New Mexico, and I wouldn't be the first of my friends to go missing without a trace had I opened my tent and followed that voice that night. Somehow I shook it off and was tired enough to start drifting to sleep after I got cozied up. And that's when it actually tried to get me. That half-awake state being sleeping and awake. You know, the place where you suddenly feel like you're falling but get jolted awake? Except this time, I wasn't falling. Something had grabbed onto my tent and was dragging it at what felt like 50 miles an hour across the forest floor. I felt every bump when the tent was hitting tree stumps and rocks, destroying my tent and thrashing me around viciously as I was being pulled at an insane speed through the trees. It was going seemingly in a straight line, though, which didn't make any sense in hindsight with how dense the trees are there. I yelled out and could feel my vocal cords moving, but very little sound came out. I must have traveled a good several hundred feet like that. And that's when I opened my eyes. The only thing that felt different was the tent was no longer moving. During this weird trance state of being dragged in my tent, everything looked identical. I was perfectly aware of my surroundings, and it felt nothing like a dream. However, when I finally opened my eyes, I was laying in my tent, seemingly undisturbed and unharmed. I called out to my friend, feeling bad for waking him up, but needing to know that this was reality, as the last place felt so real. He groggily woke up and said something back to me before going back to sleep. His response sounded legitimate to me, and I thought, that actually sounds like him, realizing that whatever I had heard earlier was so far from anything he would actually do or say. The thing that called out to me was in a high-pitched, whiny voice mimicking my friend saying, help me, I need help, I have to pee, come out here." It still weirds me out to this day. After asking him about it the next morning, he just laughed and swore to me that he absolutely did not get up in the middle of the night and say anything to me, much less try to joke with me about getting out of my tent to help him. Whatever it was, it specifically targeted me. My friends have been back there since, but I opted out of that trip. A Creature at Camp by Pyromaniac. This story took place at a church camp, which is sort of like a Christian summer camp. At the time, I was 8 years old. It started at night when I was trying to sleep. It was hot, and I felt like something heavy was sitting on my chest. Not like a weight, but like a hand. I could feel each individual finger pressing down, almost like it was trying to pierce my chest with its fingertips. When I opened my eyes, I was so scared I almost burst into tears right then and there. But I felt like if I did, something even worse would happen. Not just to me, but to the other kids in the room with me as well. So instead, I just lay there in my bunk, trying not to keep it from knowing that I was awake. After a few hours, it stopped and left. What I saw when I opened my eyes was a tall, skinny figure with long arms. It had black eyes with red pupils that almost glowed in the dark, large hands with slender fingers, and a mouth so wide, if it opened its mouth, it would look like a hole. When I woke up in the morning, I felt a burning sensation on my chest, and when I looked, I saw red marks where the thing had touched me. Things were pretty much normal until the middle of the day, when everyone had to go to the main building and we would all attend church and pray. While we were in the middle of a prayer, I opened my eyes to look up at the front of the room, and I saw the figure standing in front of me. And when I saw it, it put one hand over its mouth and pushed the other hand into my chest. It didn't tear a hole in my chest. Instead, it just went inside like it wasn't there. But I could still feel it inside my chest, its hand wrapped around my heart. Not a squeezing feeling, but a burning feeling, almost like a red-hot fire poker touching bare skin. I was crying the whole time, trying to pull its hand off of my chest, but I wasn't strong enough, and it only stopped after the prayer was over. It just disappeared and was gone, but I could still feel the burning sensation in my chest after we were done in the church. Then the day continued like normal. The thing was done doing what it needed to do. After that incident, I never went back to church camp again, and I also stopped going to church because I never wanted to see that thing ever again. And to this day, I'm happy to say that I haven't seen it since. Pissed Off Monkey by Lee. This past September, my son and I had a run-in with what we believe were multiple Sasquatch while kayaking the lower Buffalo River, a wilderness section in Arkansas. We were on day 2 of our trip, and we were specifically there to fish for smallmouth bass. It was around 4 p.m. when we went through a narrow section and around in an obstruction, and all hell broke loose. This thing was at the river's edge when it bolted through the woods like a bulldozer. The crazy thing about it is that it sounded like a pissed-off monkey as it ran tearing through the woods. We went a little over 2 river miles and made camp on a narrow gravel bar. While we were setting up camp, we heard a tree knock across the river from us. We joked about it being Bigfoot and just kept on setting up camp. After everything was established, I broke out my weather radio to check our regional forecast for the next day due to a high percentage of rain in the area. After about 20 minutes of listening to several regional forecasts, I turned the radio off. Right after that, we heard a yell come off the ridge from us close to the tree knock location. Well, from that point until 4 a.m., all hell broke loose. We experienced rocks being thrown off the bluff into the river, more tree knocks, and the pissed-off monkey sounds multiple times. Deep chatter, a log being snapped in two, and a freaky sound that was like something singing. We had to set up a lighted perimeter, and we pulled a cot out of one of the tents and set it up by the fire. We set up a 2-hour fire watch shift where someone would be awake the entire time. When the log snapped just inside the tree line behind us, it was around 3:30 a.m. We were both awake, and we decided to break down camp to show that we had intentions of leaving. Everything ended at that point, and we were in our kayaks at first light. As soon as we were getting into them, the last rock came flying off the ridge, clipping trees on the way down, and it hit the river. We were done and got off the river that day. The worst thing about it all was we were on a section of the river we'd never been on, so we weren't able to run it in the middle of the night. We were stuck between the river and the woods on a narrow gravel bar, and we literally had nowhere to go. I truly believe if we had done one thing wrong, we wouldn't be here today. There was nothing friendly about that night, and it seemed the pissed-off monkey was extremely upset that we surprised him and was holding a grudge. After returning home, I contacted a ranger friend of mine that put me in contact with a ranger stationed on the Buffalo River. That was an extremely interesting conversation. I want to let people know there is definitely something on that river, and my whole purpose for reaching out to the ranger was for safety reasons. I didn't want to read about a family getting hurt on that section of the river, and me not saying anything. Did I Encounter a Skinwalker by Clumsy Salad Goat. This experience is one I never shared with anyone besides my brother. When I was about 13 years old, I was living in rural British Columbia. One night I was in the hot tub on the deck outside just watching the woods, taking in the silence. It was around 2 or 3 a.m., and out of nowhere this very large wolf, bigger than anyone I had ever seen by far, came out of the woods. I remember its coat being a shimmering silver, and it had bright, piercing green eyes. As this wolf was walking along the fence of our paddock, it locked eyes with mine, and we just kind of stared at each other as he walked past me, both alone in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. What happened next to this day instantly makes my spine shiver. As the wolf walked past, he walked towards our barn with our horses in it. It became darker as it entered the barn, but the other side of the barn still had a bright light illuminating the outside that I could clearly see. This wolf, as it entered, halfway through, it went from the shape of a wolf to a very large, broad-shouldered person. The horses didn't make a single sound, and this person rounded the corner towards the open field, but didn't emerge from the other side, and I never saw it again. My brother had his own encounter with this same wolf, I'm guessing, and he told me that he had woken up randomly one night from the feeling of being watched. He then looked out his window to see a very large wolf walking away from his window, so I'm guessing it was watching him sleep. The place we lived at was old native ground, and our barn was an old schoolhouse where the Catholic priest would put the native children. It even had the old desks and chairs still inside. My brother and I both saw children's faces in the panes of glass from that barn and lights turning on randomly. We had closet doors slam repeatedly for minutes at a time, the sound of footsteps and feelings of being watched. In my room, I saw glowing red eyes on the ceiling one night, and I hid under my covers till morning. Anyway, my main subject of this, and what I'm seeking more answers for, is what did I encounter outside in the middle of that night? After I looked around myself, the closest thing I could find was skinwalkers or wendigos. But from what I read, these creatures have deformed features of things that make them uncanny or straight up horrific. Nothing struck me abnormal about this wolf besides its massive size, until it literally changed its entire form in front of me. I know this is a long-winded story. I'm sorry, I'm not a great storyteller. And there's just so much that I experienced at this property. This just scratches the surface to everything. The wolf incident is just something I've really never been able to grasp, and always wanted some kind of answer for, because it feels and sounds unbelievable. The Hollers by Arctic Inhabitor. Growing up in rural Alaska, I experienced a lot of weird things, amazing herds of caribou, etc. But the weirdest thing to me are the times I wasn't able to see the source of yelling or hollering. A lot of times, I traveled alone throughout the Brooks Range and up onto the North Slope to hunt and trap. From a young age, I learned how to hunt and field dress animals, set up survival shelters, and even how to travel at night with the usage of the constellations, like my ancestors before me. These long and very arduous journeys sometimes brought me more than I was willing to endure. In the winter of 2017, I had a trap line along the left side of a valley headed northbound. A trap was set every few miles, and I was traveling along my trail when I saw a figure in a bunch of diamond willows ahead of me. The bunch of brush was about a mile or so away, but I could see the dark figure walking like a person. I wondered who would be out in January when it's the coldest time of the year just walking, when they suddenly vanished. I took out my binoculars and scanned the area and just put it off as my imagination or someone with a snow machine, a snowmobile for you lower 48ers, and they had taken off along my trail. So I continued on. At my next trap, I stopped and shut off my machine. It was calm and surprisingly warm for that time of year, like -30 Fahrenheit, so I was able to shed my parka to reset the spring trap that I had come across. As I set the trap, I started to hear a low, bellowing noise from up in a small valley. It came off like a person just yelling, "Ah!" at first. But then it grew deeper, like a bear warning off another. But it was January. Nothing like that would be out and about. The most you'd find would be wolves, wolverines, and caribou. I mean, even moose tend to travel south for that time of the year. As I started to pack up, the noise began again. It grew louder and louder. I remembered that figure I saw and wondered if they had anything to do with it. But I did my best to ignore the noise like my elders had taught me and go about my business. Then I could feel eyes on me. I looked towards the valley where I felt the weird sensation, and there was nothing. I even pulled out my binos and looked. Nothing. I listened for the noise again, and when the bellowing began again, I responded. I made the same noise back at it, and it stopped quickly, like it recognized the noise I made. Then it was silent. I was so uneasy, I packed up and left as quickly as possible. I haven't been back there since. I pulled the trap line that winter, and I don't plan on going back. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or the podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Please give this video a like if you did like it. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you thought of the stories. And think about subscribing. That would be awesome. Follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. And if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page, as well as my storefront at tpublic.com. Get yourself some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. I do have to take a quick second here and dedicate this podcast to a friend of mine who passed away this week. Interestingly enough, when I first met him a little over a year ago, he was more familiar with me than I him. For a couple of weeks, he didn't say anything, but one day he said, "Man, your voice is so familiar." And it turns out he's been listening to my podcast for years and had no idea it was actually me as the narrator. We laughed about that, and he was just totally amazed that he was hanging out with Uncle Josh. Yeah, like I'm some kind of rock star. He was a young guy, and I'm really going to miss him. So, a little sadness to end this one, but rest in peace wherever you are, Frank. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.